the next presentation, which is on essentially protecting air quality. And our presenter here for this topic is David Pettit, who's an attorney at the NRDC, where he's worked for 13, 14 years, focusing on curbing pollution in California by litigating against industries, campaigning for clean forms of energy, and promoting green development in urban areas. He's litigated environmental cases in trial and appellate courts, both state and federal, and including a number of cases that have changed the way, made a change to the law regulating air pollution, groundwater pollution, and habitat preservation. So take it away, Dave.
Thanks, Dean. It's a tough act to follow Nicole, but I'll see what I can do here. Okay, that should be working. And Dean, can you see my PowerPoint on the screen?
Yes, but you should probably go into slideshow mode. We see like the little thumbnails at the left. So if you start the slideshow, yeah, like that.
Okay.
Beautiful.
Okay, good. Thanks again for inviting me to speak on this and for assembling the lineup. It's really a cool lineup that you have. So my day job, if you will, is air quality and climate change. Mostly I do litigation these days, but a lot of what I do is also policy work. For example, advocating in front of CARB or in front of South Coast or other agencies, sometimes the city of LA, and a lot of advocacy which has been very frustrating with the ports, the LA and Long Beach ports, which are really not stepping up to the plate, I think is an understatement. So in doing that, I often represent and work with community groups and EJ groups and try to advance their positions as well as help with capacity building for those groups so that they can continue to kick butt in all the forums what they're present in. So let me talk a little about that work and how this stuff works, and I'll talk about the conceptual framework and then some about the practical realities. So what's the problem that we're looking at? Let me skip ahead. Just yesterday, the 2020 American Lung Association report came out, and this is always a really interesting and depressing read. They look at air quality nationwide, and here on this slide is some of the data that they have come up with for California. So 7 of the 10 most ozone polluted cities in America are in California, and here in LA, we're number one. We're number one, and we have been for something like 29 out of the past 30 years. We've been the number 1 worst city in the U.S. for ozone pollution, which does tell you something about the kind of job that South Coast is doing. They like to present those graphs showing how much better air quality is. And yeah, it's better than, I grew up here and it's better than it was when I was a kid, but we still have the worst in the country, and there's really no sign of that changing anytime soon, particularly with the lineup they have on the governing board now out there in Diamond Bar. So when you look at the annual particle levels, particulate matter levels, 6 of the 10 most polluted cities are in California, and Bakersfield has beat us out for number 1 in the most polluted city in terms of annual particulate matter. And then if you look at the short-term particulate matter, 5 of the 10 most polluted are in California, and there the Fresno area is number 1 for short-term particulates. And if you've driven up to 99 to go north on a bad day, it's pretty easy to see where this comes from and what the ALA is talking about between the truck traffic and the agricultural uses and the oil refineries and the like. San Joaquin Valley really gets hammered with bad air quality. So you can see that our state is doing particularly badly nationally in terms of air quality. Regionally, it's worse here in South Coast and up in the San Joaquin Valley. The other big air district, the Bay Area, is better off in a lot of ways, although they do have an ozone problem, and they've got a bunch of refineries up there they need to contend with, much as we do here. Locally, I probably don't need to tell this audience, we have lots of hot spots, and the way the weather patterns work here, that often a lot of the junk that's created locally gets blown into the Inland Empire and up against the San Gabriel Mountains. And that raises a lot of issues, including EJ issues about who's actually suffering, particularly from the truck-related pollution, and pollution, for example, from the oil refineries and power plants that are near the coast. Many of the truck issues arise from commerce at the ports of LA and Long Beach, where containers are then trucked by diesel out to the Inland Empire and warehouses and the like. And as you probably know, if you look at who lives near the ports, who lives along the truck routes, who lives out in the warehouse district, those tend to be EJ communities. And so there are environmental justice and environmental racism issues that go right along with and are really coincident, in my view, with the air quality issues that we see here in California. And really much the same can be said up in the San Joaquin Valley. You can take a look at the Cal EnviroScreen tool and really dig down at the census tract level and see where the really bad air pollution is. And it probably won't surprise anybody on this call to find that it's very closely correlated with the location of environmental justice communities. So let me talk a bit about the types of air pollution that we see here in California. In general, although not exclusively, we're looking at the products of the combustion of fossil fuels. So, you know, it's easy to say, oh yeah, we can fix this. You just need to get rid of, you know, internal combustion engine cars and the production of power by, you know, burning of natural gas and the like. But it's much easier said than done. We at NRDC have also been doing some of this work in China, which is now the largest GHG emitter in the world, trying to get them to switch over from fossil fuel combustion, and they in fact are increasing their building of coal plants right now. So it's not working well there. And here there are many issues with this. Nicole talked about the new fuel economy rules that the feds have come out with. Something else that I'm working on, and those intend to roll back the clock, as it were, on the fuel economy rules. And if they're successful against the litigation that is coming, we're going to see even more pollution because, you know, with lower mileage and increasing VMT, at least probably after the virus crisis is over, you're going to see more emissions from combustion and worse air quality, particularly here in California and in the Northeast. So again, the biggest targets, if you're looking around for, you know, bang for the buck basis, is looking at fossil fuel combustion and how to get rid of that. You'll hear the term criteria pollutants thrown around by air quality nerds. This is just a reference to a few pollutants that are called out in the Federal Clean Air Act, and they're the ones that we mainly think about here in Southern California. Ozone is probably the biggest. Ground level ozone you can think of as smog. And another that you'll hear about, the nerds talk about, NOx, which means oxides of nitrogen, and SOx, oxides of sulfur. NOx is almost entirely a product of fossil fuel combustion, and NOx combines in the atmosphere with volatile organic compounds, you know, like the new car smell that you get, or a lot of the stuff you smell when you drive by an oil refinery. So NOx combines in the atmosphere with that stuff chemically to create ozone. So you'll see a lot of attention paid, for example, by South Coast to reducing NOx emissions. And the reason they're doing that is to try to get the ozone levels down. SOx emissions also come from largely from burning fuels, and a lot of that comes from burning marine fuel by big ocean-going vessels. So we have a problem with that at the ports. The big vessels are now burning cleaner fuel as a result of some some international regulation, but there's still a big problem. And again, because of the wind patterns, those emissions tend to drift away from the ports and into the inland empire. There are other types of air pollution that are not the products of fossil fuel combustion. These can be called hazardous air products, sometimes toxic air contaminants. And you see a lot of this around, dry cleaning facilities are big sources. Oil refineries are really large sources of this kind of stuff. Again, if you drive by an oil refinery, you take a deep breath and things smell kind of chemically, that's what you're smelling, is volatile organic compounds that are also hazardous to your health. One that is often associated with that is benzene. And I just, a quick digression for a stupid story. When I was a kid, a high school kid, I had a job working in a circuit board factory, and we used to use liquid benzene as a degreaser. We just wash our hands with it because it worked really well. And nobody, I think, really knew what the problem was in those days, or if they did, they didn't tell me. So, that could explain a lot. But anyhow, this stuff is in the air near oil refineries and sometimes near oil drilling facilities, and is very bad for human health. So let me talk about how all this stuff is regulated. The fundamental statute in this area is the Federal Clean Air Act, which was enacted in 1970 and amended a number of times since, most notably in 1990. And the Clean Air Act sets up the basic structure for air quality regulation in the US. It has a conceptual divide in it, which you may think doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's how it is. They have a conceptual divide between mobile sources like cars and trucks and stationary sources, things that don't move, like an oil refinery or a coal-fired power plant. And those have different avenues of regulation that I'll talk about in a moment. The federal agency that's charged with implementing the Clean Air Act is, of course, US EPA. And you see, as presidential administrations change, that EPA regulation can get tougher or less tough. And right now, we're definitely on the speedy road to hell, given what the Trump administration is trying to do. Nicole had talked about, scores of lawsuits by the California Attorney General. We at NRDC, we now have over 100 lawsuits against the Trump administration over clean air and other matters. Most of them that have gone to resolution, we've won. Some we have not won, but that's been keeping us a lot of us busy since the end of 2016, when the nightmare started. So EPA regulations are very important on a sort of day-to-day level about how these other regulatory agencies work. We also have the California Clean Air Act, which is not widely known, and it also has some numerical limits in it. The problem with it is that it's difficult for private individuals to enforce the California Clean Air Act. The local air boards can, but it's difficult for us to do that, as opposed to the Federal Clean Air Act, which can be enforced by individual litigants. When it comes to the state level, there's really sort of two different species, if you will, of administrative agencies that are at work here. One is the California Air Resources Board that everyone calls CARB or ARB, and the other are the regional air quality boards like the South Coast out in Diamond Bar, the Bay Area, AQMD, and the San Joaquin Valley, AQMD, those being the three biggest in the state. So the way the jurisdictions are divided up, again, this may not make a lot of sense, but it's kind of how it is that CARB is responsible for regulating mobile sources like cars and trucks. And the regional air quality boards are charged with regulating stationary sources like oil refineries. So if you're an oil refinery, you need to get a permit under the Federal Clean Air Act to emit the various kinds of stuff that you think you are going to emit. And to get that in California, if you were in, say, Wilmington, you would go to the South Coast AQMD and apply for this permit, and there would be administrative proceedings, and the public can appear and contest these, although they're highly technical, so it's difficult to do that. And then eventually they would probably get their permit and would need to do daily reporting to South Coast about permit compliance. You hear the local air boards, including South Coast, complain all the time that they can't meet their clean air targets because of the effect from mobile sources like trucks that the local air boards, are unable to regulate. That doesn't carry any weight for me because the local air boards do have the authority to enact what are called indirect source rules, where a local board can regulate a geographic area where a lot of mobile sources get together. For example, a bunch of us have been advocating for years that South Coast needs to regulate the LA and Long Beach ports as indirect sources and tell the ports, okay, here's your emissions limit. And if you breach it, all kinds of bad things are going to happen, including a reduction in throughput. They have the legal power to do that. They could do it today, but they don't have the political will to do it. And instead, the South Coast Governing Board has told its staff, well, go out and try to work out a deal with the ports. That has been going on for 18 months and has gone exactly nowhere. So theoretically, the regional boards can regulate area sources of mobile pollution, but it's politically very difficult for them to do that. So where do the limits on pollution come from? Many of them come from the US Clean Air Act, and you'll hear the nerd expression NAAQS thrown around, National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So for a number of pollutants, the feds set limits, and those are supposed to be reviewed every 4 or 5 years. And again, it makes a big difference what administration is in power for how robust the science is. The review process is open to the public, and people can comment, and at the end of the day, people can litigate whether the federal limits are appropriate or not. But again, that's a long, drawn out and extremely technical process that combines science, economics, politics, and all sorts of stuff. I have to say, we were not entirely happy with the way the Obama administration handled some of those, and it's a million times worse now under Trump. So you get these limits, and if a state or a region is not in compliance, or the word you use in the trade is attainment, but if you're not in compliance with the federal number, then you, the state, have to prepare what's called a state implementation plan, a SIP, where you tell the feds, okay, here's how we're going to come into compliance. And once those plans are approved back at EPA, they become enforceable. So they have the power of law, federal law, in fact, and can be enforced by anyone in California. There are also, as I mentioned, limits on pollution in the California Clean Air Act. And CARB has certain limits that it can put on certain mobile sources, in part depending on its relationship with EPA. As Nicole also mentioned, CARB has, for many years, had the power to set its own tailpipe emission standards under a series of waivers under the Clean Air Act. But late last year, the feds had purported to take away that ability with respect to greenhouse gas emissions. So that's being litigated as we speak. CARB still, as we talk today, has the authority to limit tailpipe emissions under waivers that it's received from the feds, but right now does not have the authority to regulate tailpipe GHG emissions, which in my opinion is completely stupid, but that's what we've got right now. So who enforces all these laws? Well, US EPA has enforcement powers. they're not doing much these days under the current administration. The California Air Resources Board, represented by the Attorney General, can represent both state and federal clean air laws. Local air quality boards can bring enforcement actions. South Coast occasionally, gets off its butt and brings actions like this to shut down an offending business, although they don't have a lot of staff available to do that. As I mentioned before, residents can bring lawsuits under the Federal Clean Air Act, under the SIP process, often under state law, against polluting industries or facilities. Those can also be highly technical and lengthy and difficult to process. So it's not a walk in the park to do that. That's part of my day job, and they're difficult to do. Local governments sometimes can enforce clean air laws, for example, by bringing nuisance cases against, for example, a local business. The problem with that I see in the ports area is the local governments, they run the ports. And so, and the local city attorneys represent the ports of LA and Long Beach, so they're not really going to turn around and sue them. There have also been some Prop 65 and personal injury claims brought, for example, against the ports and against companies like Exide when people are injured by air pollution. We don't get into that at NRDC. That's not really our gig, but there is a part of the private bar that does that. So how do you change the clean air laws? Well, federal statutes need to be changed by Congress. Nobody really wants Congress to get into reopening the Clean Air Act for fear of what bad things may happen. EPA regulations are supposed to be changed by the procedure under the Federal Administrative Procedure Act, which can take years. The Trump administration has tried to shortcut this in a number of areas, particularly in the methane regulation, and we've been able to pretty much shut them down in court because you really need to, you can't just make stuff up. You really need to go through these long established processes. With CARB regulations, kind of the same thing. There's a State Administrative Procedure Act, and various procedural steps, including public hearings, need to occur before state regulations can be changed. Yes, very similarly, local air quality boards need to go through, at minimum, the state Brown Act procedures with public notice and the like before local regulations can be changed. In all of those, there's opportunity for public advocacy and comment, although it's often difficult, in my experience, for local groups to compete with industry when it comes to a lot of the technical stuff that's going on. One of the big issues that I litigate now is, do GHGs count as air pollutants? But I'm going to duck that question because the next speaker, Michael Gerard, he literally wrote the book on this stuff. So I'm going to stick around to listen to him answer this question. So that's all I have. Thank you for your time. I'm going to attempt to get back to Zoom and see if we have questions.
So Dave, I think we actually do have a couple questions on the Q&A facility.
Okay, all right, I'm back. Okay, question, what are EJ communities? That means environmental justice communities, and there's a number of definitions. I think of them primarily as low-income communities of color. For example, I'm talking to you from Santa Monica, California, which is not one, but many of my clients live and work, for example, in Wilmington, California, which, or at least neighborhoods in Wilmington, are environmental justice communities. Again, if you drive around at the ports or you go out the 710 freeway or the 60 freeway, where a lot of the trucks go, and you look at who lives in those areas, it's, it's not people who live like in Santa Monica, but it tends to be, Latino, African-American, Asian Pacific people, typically low income, struggling to make a living, trying to raise their families. And we've seen a history of environmental racism in California, both in housing, in jobs, and also in where the heavily polluting sites are physically located. I mean, nobody's going to build an oil refinery here in Santa Monica, but look at where they are. Look at where they are built, and I believe that's not accidental. Next question. Excuse me. Hi in Europe, Belgium. Hi in Belgium. Almost no cars driving. We see that air pollution is not going down. Is traffic then less important than expected? How will this influence public opinion? As activists said, the problem is with cars, and now the cars are apparently not the cause. It's a very interesting question. Here in Southern California, the air is bluer than I've seen since I was a little kid, and I think that's largely because of cars. But in China, when when all of this erupted, they still had terrible smog in the Northeast, in Beijing and surrounding areas, because they did not shut down industry the way that they have here. And so you did see a reduction in auto traffic, but you did not see a corresponding reduction in industrial production. So the power plants were still running, the steel factories and the like were all still happening. So, it's interesting what's going to come of the theory that, well, if we just, get rid of cars and factories, everything will be great again and nature will restore itself. That really is, I think, disrespectful to people's need to earn a living and feed their families. So cars are going to come back at some point. We're still a long ways off from having even a substantial number of electric vehicles. Even here in California, factory production is going to pick up again. And I think it's good that we've seen how things can be in terms of air pollution here in Southern California. It gives us more than just a dream to look at, but we still have a lot of work to do, and it's not all cars. Question from Ashley Cohen. How can we change building policies? So we know 50% of emissions come from our built environment. In her lovely state of Washington, green building codes are far behind and are mostly only encouraged by firms and architects. That's kind of funny. Maybe it shouldn't be. Here in California, in fact, in my first city, Santa Monica, we have enacted what are called REACH codes, R-E-A-C-H, which we can do under state law, where we are able to go farther in both in building electrification and in changing building codes to be more environmentally conscious. We are able to go farther than the state building code would allow. And so that's a question both of our state law and the interest of local residents in making things better. So I don't know anything about the legal background in Washington, but here the very nerdy issue of building codes, it's hard to get people excited about that, but as you say, it's hugely influential in what our built environment looks like, both in the future and in retrofitting the stuff we already have. I think it can be a productive area of advocacy, and if you can get the building industry behind it, all the better. That is working out pretty well in some cities in California. San Jose is really kicking butt on that. Berkeley here in Santa Monica. So some changes can occur for the good.
David, it's Dean. I think we need to move on to Michael Gerard at this point.
Great. Well, the next question is his anyhow. I was going to duck it. So okay. Thank you for your attention, folks.
Yeah, David, thank you very much. That was a great presentation. It's very helpful. We appreciate it very much.